Greetings to all attendees and welcome to the fifth session of the Islamic History and Thought lecture series organized by the Institute of Isma'ili Studies. If you have missed the previous lectures of the series, or if you wish to see them again, they have been recorded and can be watched either on the IIS website or on the newly created YouTube channel of the Institute of Isma'ili Studies. So today I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Olly Akkerman, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Islamic Studies at Freie Universität in Berlin. Dr. Akkerman is a codicologist specializing in Arabic manuscripts, as well as an anthropologist. And at the crossroad of these two fields, her original research examined the social life of manuscript repository among the Bohras in South Asia and the larger Western Indian Ocean. Her publications include the Bohra Manuscript Treasury as a Sacred Site of Philology, a study in social codicology, which is an article published in 2019 in the journal Philological Encounters. And she also has a forthcoming monograph bearing the same title as today's lecture, a Neo-Fatimid Treasury of Books, Arabic Manuscripts among the Alavi Bohras of South Asia. So this monograph will be published in 2022 by Edinburgh University Press. So I will not say more and will let Dr. Akkerman present her research, which she will do much more eloquently than I can. The lecture will last for about 30 to 45 minutes and will be followed by a discussion with Dr. Samira Sheikh, who kindly accepted to take part in this session, and myself. And Dr. Sheikh is Associate Professor in History at Vanderbilt University, and she specializes in South Asian history. She has worked at the Institute of Isma'ili Studies, where she co-edited the book, An Anthology of Isma'ili Literature, a Shi'a Vision of Islam.
Thank you, Faris, for this kind introduction. Hello to the audience. Let me start by sharing my PowerPoint with you. So here we go. Right, let me start by thanking Faris, of course, and the Institute of Isma'ili Studies for inviting me to this very interesting lecture series, which from the comfort of my own couch, I've really enjoyed thus far. Of course, also a big thank you to Professor Samira Sheikh, who has kindly agreed to be the discussant of this paper. And finally, I would also like to thank the audience, who unfortunately I cannot see directly, but I know that in addition to perhaps some scholarly interests, that various members of the Alavi Bohra community are tuning in with us from Baroda, including, as I believe, also the Da'il Mutlaq of the community, Sayyidina Hatem Zakiuddin, and also other clerics. And later I'll explain to you why these individuals are very important to the community. But I would just like to also express the fact that I'm very honored by their presence. In fact, I'm not only honored, but I think it's actually very important that members of the Bohra community are here today to take part in the discussion. Which, because it is essentially about their community and their manuscripts. And this also fits into sort of the larger discussion of my forthcoming book, where, Faris, of course, you already introduced it. But in my forthcoming book, I really look at the Alavi Bohras' Neo-Fatimid identity as expressed through their manuscripts. As Tayyib Ismailis, the Alavi Bohras and other Bohras actually consider themselves heirs of the Fatimid Imamate, an Ismaili empire that ruled over much of the Mediterranean and North Africa from the 10th to the 12th century. Now, to the outsider, the worlds of the secrecy practicing Bohras of Gujarat today and those of the Fatimid Caliph Imams of medieval Cairo might seem light years apart. Yet through the written word, materialized in manuscripts and documents, we will see that these worlds are actually intrinsically connected. So in this book, what I'm doing is, instead of looking at the manuscripts of the community only as vehicles of text and intellectual history, which is of course already very interesting in itself, I'm interested also in how manuscripts gain meaning through their social surroundings, right? So I asked the question, what is it that people do with manuscripts and why? Why are these manuscripts so important to the community? And what is it exactly that the Alawis, what they do with them? Perhaps before we introduce the Alavi Bohras in more detail, perhaps a short note on the research that I did on the community. It was in the monsoon season of 2012, which is already a very long time ago, that I was in the privileged position to spend several times in the Alavi Bohra Mohalla, in the Alavi Bohra quarter in Baroda, in Gujarat, not only studying its manuscripts, but also taking part in the daily activities of the communities, in the ceremonies, really observing also the life of the Mohalla. And well, as some of perhaps, well, Samir already knows this was somehow coincidental, because I have actually been trained very classically in Europe as a codicologist, meaning that I look at the material aspects of manuscripts, philology, the reading of books, of their content, and even paleography of scripts. However, while I was in Baroda, I noticed that, I sort of learned how to observe, study, and even catalog these manuscripts with the community, instead of looking at manuscripts in what we usually do, which is in sort of libraries in the West, right? So I read the manuscripts with sort of their custodians, with the clerics, and really observed how their manuscript collection functions in situ. And that is a very different perspective from, for instance, if we look at, Bohra manuscript collections that, for instance, the Institute of Isma'ili Studies at the moment has, which are very interesting collections, of course, belonging to families who have donated these manuscripts. However, they're sort of taken out of their living situation as such. And well, in the book, what I do is try to sort of bridge, on the one hand, the materiality of the manuscripts through paleography and so forth, but also, also bring in, sort of try to understand their social role. Why do they matter so much to the community? And that is sort of the anthropological side. And in the article that Faris already mentioned, well, I've called this social codicology, this approach. And I think that is part of a larger sort of trend in manuscript studies, where we've really taken into account the social surroundings of books and texts. So I'm thinking, for instance, of the work of Brinkley Messick, who has done something similar in the context of Yemen, studying fiqh manuscripts. And the whole idea behind the social codicological approach is really also to give a voice to the community. And again, that's why I'm very happy that they're also attending today. And also give agency to the people who read, who copy, and who are their custodians. And I think it was no coincidence that sort of this perspective developed in the Alavi Bohra community, because the Alavi Bohras, together perhaps with the Daudi Bohras, are one of the very last Muslim communities in the world that still preserve a living manuscript culture. And with preserve, I don't necessarily mean, they have an old book from the past and they put it in a museum. This, of course, is, we can see that anywhere. But what I think is unique about the Alavi Bohras is that they preserve a living manuscripts. They still copy manuscripts by hand. And these manuscripts are not just, stuffed away somewhere, but actually form a central, really a central role in the daily lives of the believers of the Mohalla, as objects of secrecy that cannot be accessed, as sacred objects that are venerated, and of course as carriers of the Ismaili doctrine. So in this talk, I would like to, well, obviously first I have to introduce the Alavi Bohra community, and we really look at what, well, I sort of call what it is that constitutes their Neo-Fatimid identity, right? What do I mean with the term, and so forth. And we really see how this identity today in the present is constructed, not only through manuscript, but all kinds of other practices as well. So that is sort of, first we look at the narrative of the community, how they see themselves, how they practice it, and then we dive into what I call, well, the treasury of books. And that's another note that I would like to quickly sort of throw in there. Well, the title of this talk is also called A Neo-Fatimid Treasury of Books. Of course, one, I think, cannot sort of study the manuscripts in this context without understanding the spaces where they are stored, and in the case of the Bohras, really enshrined also as sacred objects. And I've chosen to stay very close to the Arabic terms that the Bohras use themselves, which is khizanatul kutub, which is actually, as we will see, also a term that somehow is linked to their Fatimid past. But I've chosen to stick with that treasuries of books, which is quite a literal translation, instead of using notions such as archive of library, which in the case of the Bohras do not apply, as sort of modern Western concepts of, for instance, a library where you can be a member of and you can borrow books there, or a state archive where there are documents that can be requested. That is not at all, as we will see, how the Khizanatul Kutub works. This is not to say that this never functions. I mean, Marina Rustov has, of course, I think it was last year that she published a very impressive book on Fatimid state archives. I think in this context, it totally works. However, in the context of the Bohras, I think we stick with Khizanatul Kutub to really get also a better feeling of what this means and how it functions. So let us have a look first at, well, who are the Alavi Bohras and sort of where can they be found and so forth. So if we look at the larger history of Shi'ism, I think we can all agree that this is a history that is characterized by schisms, by bifurcations. We have many different groups, of course. We have the 12ers, the 5ers, and of course the 7ers or the Isma'ilis. But this group is much more diverse, of course, than just the Isma'ilis, right? So we have the Nizari Ismailis, who of course follow a living imam as the Aga Khan, and then we have the Bohras. So the Bohras, and we will come to this in a bit, actually have a hidden imam and follow a certain genealogy of da'is, who are their vice regents on earth. So the Bohras, or Taibi Musta'alavi, Taibi Ismailis, as they're also known, they are, despite their extreme sort of links to, well, the Middle East and Fatimid Cairo, they are actually a contemporary Shi'i Muslim merchant community from Gujarat, consisting of approximately 1.2 believers. And well, we find Bohra communities all over the world, but mostly in South Asia and a lot across the larger Western Indian Ocean, East Africa, the Gulf, but of course also we have communities in Europe and in North America. Right, so let's have a look at where these three Bohra groups, where they are. So what you see here is a map of India, and the largest Bohra group there, the Dawoodi Bohras, who have their headquarters today in Surat and in Mumbai, and well, I've sort of made a blue circle there. And they consist of roughly 1 million believers. And again, I think this question of looking at the history through the lens of bifurcations, actually, that discussion is not so far away, because the Dawoodis recently had a schism within their community themselves. But we leave that aside for now. The second Bohra community, or the second biggest Bohra community, are the Alavi Bohras. If we see sort of the red circle, who have their religious headquarters in the city of Baroda. Now, I should note that today, actually, the city is called Vadodara, but the Bohras still refer its older name, Baroda, which is why I also stick to this. And this community, which is, of course, the community that we focus on today, consists of around 8,000 believers. And most believers actually live in Baroda. And then finally, we have the Sulaimani Bohras in Hyderabad. That's where the green circle is, and they are the smallest community. And what is fascinating is that all these Bohra communities, despite the fact that they follow different lineages of dais, that they sort of share the same past, they read the same books, and they have the same sort of what I call Neo-Fatimid practices, and of course share a manuscript tradition in Khizanat all over South Asia, where this unique Isma'ili manuscript tradition is still preserved in a way. So as I said, each of these Bohra groups or dawas, actually the word for community that the Bohras use is da'wa, which is quite complex, and I would be happy to discuss it later, but let's just stick with da'wa. The three dawas follow separate genealogies of spiritual leaders known as the da'is. And royal in social status and considered almost infallible spiritually, the da'is are the absolute sovereigns of their community in the absence of the hidden imam. So if we go to the next slide, we see a portrait here of the Bohra sacerdotal royal family, which was taken during Muharram in 2012. And I use the term sacerdotal royal family here because on the one hand, this genealogy it is a genealogy of scholars and clerics who trace back sort of their genealogy, indirectly, to Yemen and also Fatimid Cairo. But at the same time, they're also seen as royals in a way. And I think that this idea of sort of royalty among the Bohras is a really interesting phenomenon that definitely awaits further study. So who do we see in this picture? The gentleman sitting to the left is the late Dai of the community, Tayyib Ziauddin, and the gentleman sitting to the right is the current Dai, Hatim Zakiuddin. And next to them, we have the individuals who are next in line to the throne of the community. Actually, that is the Mazum Sahib, who is not in this picture. Then to the left, we have the Muqassir Sahib, and then to the right, the Ras al-Hudud Sahib. And why do I explain to you sort of all these terms and names? Because what is fascinating is that these hierarchies, clerical hierarchies, well, first of all, they're Arabic terms. I now pronounce them a little bit different, but they're Arabic terms that we find back in various Fatimid treatises that actually, well, the Isma'ili Institute has, of course, been editing over the last couple of years. And that is definitely, in fact, a fascinating link in a way. That's sort of the hierarchy of the dawah. And later we can discuss, again, the term dawah can mean different things, but that still continues to exist. So that's one example. Right. So if we, I see something has gone wrong here. Yes. So here we have a slide of a gathering in the mosque in Badri Mohalla, which is the Bohra quarter in Baroda. And what we basically see here is we have the Da'i seated in the middle, and then around him is sort of the royal family, and around them the Mu'mineen. And here again, we see an interesting reference to the Fatimids, because the Bohras, at least Bohra men, they all wear white. So they wear a sort of a white shalwar kameez and a white golden topi. And to the Bohras, this again symbolizes their link to the Fatimids, because they say that it was actually the arch enemies of the Fatimids, the Abbasids, their color was black, the color of the empire was also black, and therefore we must wear white. Now it's interesting because one can of course say, well, a lot of these things are modern inventions, reconstruction of identity. But if we, for instance, look into works of Isma'ili fiqh from the Fatimid period, we see also, again, this reverence of the color white. So here we have another example. Now, of course, the Bohra community does not only consist of men, but also of women. And actually, the women of the community play a very active role in sort of the religious daily life of the Mohalla. And their sartorial practice is a bit different, and I think very interesting. So all Bohris, also the Dawdis, and I think to a certain extent the Sulaimanis, all Bohri women wear the rida. which is a very colorful garment consisting of a cape decorated with lace and a skirt. And while wearing this outfit screams Bora, right? We just saw the slide. I think we have to go back. Sorry about that. Yes. While I was doing my fieldwork, I also wore a Bora, and wherever I would go outside of Mahalla, everyone would know, wow, she is somehow affiliated to the Boras, right? Yet paradoxically, even though this outfit screams Bora-ness in neon colors, paradoxically, not much is known about the Boras. And that's because they practice taqiyya. They have a very strong social practice of taqiyya, which is a dissimulation of one's religious identity, which of course is a very common practice in many Shi'i communities. And there also, I think we definitely see a shared history. But the Boras, they take an oath of secrecy in front of their dai as children, and they pledge not to share any of their doctrinal tenets. So the societies that Boris live in, which is not just in the Mohallas, but say in East Africa or in the Gulf, people don't know anything about them. And of course, it is the secret doctrinal elements that we can find that are stored in the manuscripts. We see a picture of actually the entrance of the Khizanat al-Kutub in Baroda. And the Alawis, they have preserved a collection of around 450 manuscripts. These are all manuscripts in Arabic, I should say. And then the collection also contains quite an extensive amount of documents as well. And as I said, these manuscripts are crucial also in the day-to-day religiosity of the community. So the manuscripts can actually only be accessed by the highest clerics, who have been initiated to the several levels of the esoteric knowledge, or the ahl-e-bayt in Arabic, of these texts. And of course, that creates a very interesting sort of balance in the community between those who can access it and those who cannot. Yet at the same time, because these manuscripts are, the collection consists of copies of Fatimid treatises, of post-Fatimid treatises from Yemen, and of Bora treatises from Gujarat. But these manuscripts are, it's not only their content that makes them so important to the community, but they're also venerated as, as sacred. So for instance, here we actually have a picture of the Khizanat al-Kutub in Baroda from the inside. And we see that something very funny is going on. Because what we see here, to the right, we see the dai of the community. And around him are all the cupboards that store the manuscripts that supposedly are not to be accessed by anyone, which is also the case. However, the Khizanat al-Kutub at the same time is also the headquarter of the dawah, basically. So believers come in and out, and they come to visit the dai and the royal family for blessings, to pay their salams. They come with personal problems and so forth. But as you can see in this picture, if you look below, there is actually a manuscript laying around here, right? Which is very interesting. It's supposed to be a secret manuscript, yet it's laying around there. What is it doing? And it took me months before I sort of realized this, is that the Khizana as a space is not, it exists, people know where it are, they can actually access it. Yet there are sort of hidden locks and keys in a way, because no one in the community would actually access these manuscripts. No one would pick up that manuscript and have a look at it, because that is not, that is not what one is supposed to do. And therefore, in a way, the Khizana has a very important social role in the community, because it legitimizes sort of the power of the dai, of the clerics, who are the only ones who have access to these manuscripts, who even, and I'll come to that in a bit, copy these manuscripts by hand and so forth. One last thing about the Khizana, and then we will actually get to also the manuscripts. The term Khizanat al-Kutub, as I already said, is an Arabic term. And again, this is not coincidental that the Boras use this. The Dawudis also use this term. It is, in fact, another link also to the Fatimids. And this is not only something that the Boras themselves say, but if we, for instance, look at the monumental work of Geoffrey Kahn, who has worked a lot on Fatimid documents, in several documents, he also came across the Khizanat al-Kutub as sort of as it was sort of referred as the library of the Fatimid Caliph Imams. So that is quite an interesting sort of thing. Right, let us go back. Right, so I just want to make a small sort of intervention in my talk in a way, because now I've mentioned a lot of this is Fatimid in the Bohra community, and this is in the manuscripts, and there's so many Fatimid aspects there. However, as I said, the Bohras are also a mercantile community from Gujarat, and I don't know where this slide has gone. It was a problem with Apple, and I'm very sorry. But a part of the Alavi Bohra identity is, of course, also the fact that they're Gujaratis who eat dalis and, the traditional Gujarati dish of sharing a plate. So it is very interesting to sort of observe, in a way, their multi-layered identity, right? And it is also fascinating to see what the Alavi Bohras sort of flag out and focus on in their identity, and really like to sort of bring to the forefront this idea of we are as to the Fatimid. Whereas, of course, there are many traditions, and I have written a whole chapter about this in the book, that are not necessarily or at all, of course, related to Fatimid Cairo, but are embedded in the South Asian context. However, if we look up the Wikipedia page of the Alavi Bohras today, what do we see? We don't see Bohri ladies in the Rida eating a thali. No, the first picture actually that the Alawis have selected for their page is actually, as I have marked here in red, a picture of the Al-Aqmar Mosque in Cairo, which is one of the most famous examples of Fatimid architecture. And I think, that is somehow very striking as well. And it's very odd. And again, I'm sorry that there's a wrong picture here, but if one would enter the Alavi Bohra Mohalla in Baroda, one of the first signs one gets to see is a sign saying Fatimi General Store. And this is actually not the place where one would read Fatimid text, but actually where you get your ice cream from. And while I was in the community, when I was in Baroda, I never thought about this too much because I just took everything in. But so it is always a little bit the chicken and egg discussion, right? Because of course, there are a lot of scholars who would say, well, a lot of these links to the Fatimid past that are highlighted in the Alavi Bohra identity, are perhaps modern constructions. And to a certain extent, perhaps this is true. If we look at architecture, 100 years ago, Bohra mosques did not look the way they do now. Yet, fact is that we have these manuscript collections all over Gujarat that where, Fatimid treatises from the 10th century are read. And I want to be very clear, this does not necessarily mean that we have manuscripts from original Fatimid manuscripts from the 10th century, even though there are communities who claim that they have these. I haven't seen them, but it could well be. What I'm talking about is copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of generations of copyists who have copied these manuscripts in a way. And I think that actually brings me to, as I already mentioned, oh my Lord, okay, to the living manuscript tradition of the Bohras. What I mean with living is that manuscripts are still copied by the Da'i and by the Mukassir Saab, Mazoon Saab, and Rasi Hadood by hand, with the idea also that these are sacred objects and the text can never sort of be printed. It has to be done by hand by people who are part of this genealogy of Da'is. And as such, the Bohra clerics, or in this case, the Alavi Da'i and his direct relatives, they are just thus part of, being copyists of an uninterrupted chain of manuscript tradition. of manuscripts transmission, excuse me, which is over a millennium old. And of course, yes, one can say, of course, manuscript cultures change throughout time, and in that sense, a manuscript that was copied in Fatimid Cairo in the 10th century probably looked slightly different from, say, a modern manuscript copy, because as we speak, manuscripts are being copied. However, at the same time, this is quite a unique phenomenon, because of course other Ismaili communities certainly also have very interesting manuscript traditions. However, perhaps with the exception of the Ismailis in Salamiyya, I have not come across any Ismaili community that still copies Ismaili Fatimid treatises by hand in Arabic. So that leads us to the question, can we speak of a lost Fatimid Khizana in Gujarat? Of course, if we were to follow the narrative of the community, yes, absolutely. And I think also that's very important. Yet I would like to sort of explore this a little bit, also by looking into the documents and manuscripts that I came across in Khizana. Right, so let's have a look at that. Right, so, okay, we finally have a slide that is proper. So if we look at the the narrative of the Alawis, how they sort of, sorry, a painting fell down, how they situate themselves in this uninterrupted chain of manuscript transmission, that brings us back to the 12th century. In fact, the Bohras also refer to themselves as Tayyibi Ismailis. And the community claims that it was actually before the fall of the Fatimid Empire, which fell, of course, in the 12th century. A small group of Ismailis actually already had sort of split up from the Fatimids and had established themselves in Yemen. Now, Yemen in this period had always been a sort of a stronghold of Ismailism. And for a very long time in Yemen, the Ismailis had, were supporting the Fatimid Caliph Imams. However, it was in the 12th century, right before the fall of this empire, that a small group of Ismailis splits up from Fatimid Cairo, following a different lineage of imams. And the story goes that, so they followed an imam called Imam al-Tayyib, who was at that point still an infant, and he was taken out of Cairo to Yemen. Since in Yemen also, the political situation was very unstable, the story goes that Imam Tayyib went into Sata, which means he went into seclusion at an early age. The community of his followers, who would call themselves Tayyibi Ismailis, actually continued to exist even after the fall of the Fatimid Empire. And it was the sort of highest missionary officer, who was at that time also called the Da'i, who became sort of the vice regent of the Imam Tayyib, who was in hiding during that time. Now, the Bohras, whether they're Dawdis or Alawis, what they really see themselves sort of as the survivors of the empire. And they're not alone again in this claim. But what the Bohras say is like, well, our forefathers, when they left Fatimid Cairo, they took with them a substantial amount of Arabic manuscripts from the royal Khizana. And of course, in the Bohra narrative, this is like a very fixed canon in a way that then was expanded, in the Yemeni period. Samir Tabusi has also investigated this claim in his PhD, which he wrote a long time ago, and he said, sort of the transfer of books must have happened in a much more haphazardous way. It's not clear which literature, actually arrived in Yemen, what was selected, and so forth. But the fact is that, well, we still have Yemeni copies of these manuscripts in Indian libraries, or I should say Khizanat, not in libraries. So something must have traveled from Fatimid Cairo to Taibi, Yemen. And it was in the new social reality of Taibi, Isma'ili, Yemen, that this body of manuscripts was actually reworked, preserved, and recopied over generations and generations. And let me just have a quick look at the time. Yeah. And Faraz, how much time do I still have left?
5 to 10 minutes, if that's fine with you.
Perfect. Right. So, as I said, so from the transmission from Fatimid Cairo to Taibi, Yemen is perhaps not documented as well. However, there are sources that document the travel from Taibi, Yemen to India, which again, if we look at this map, I have marked this here with these arrows, which describe this in much detail. And these sources are very fascinating. One of them is called Qaratis al-Yemen, which is a collection of letters, not written by one person, but it's actually of several decades of letters between the Taibi community in Yemen and the community of Bohras, as they were called, who already existed at that time in Gujarat. Because the Fatimids has already converted many local merchants, centuries before that. So there was an Ismaili presence at the time already. And the interesting thing about this letter is actually that it describes in detail how manuscripts traveled over the Indian Ocean in between continents. And thus far, Yemen in this period has always sort of been described as, the center where the headquarters were of the dais and where the khizanat were, and Gujarat was the periphery. However, the letters also show that actually this was not correct, and that very often Yemeni clerics would ask the Bohras for manuscript copies and for them to be sent. And now, at some point in history, in the late 16th century, due to actually manuscript looting, khizana lootings, and destructions by the Zaydis, the Taibi Ismailis are forced to move overseas. So their headquarters are moved to Gujarat. And sort of to wrap it up very briefly, in Gujarat, we see again several bifurcations, which results in the fact that today we have these three Bohra communities. So this body of texts that actually arrived in Gujarat from Yemen, then of course also a bit later became dispersed between these different libraries. Now, something that I'm not discussing in this presentation, but interestingly, officially these communities today are not in contact with each other. However, of course, they're all trying to sort of finalize their collection. And so they're asking them, do you have a copy of this manuscript? Do you have a copy of that? And in a way, that tradition, I think, is a very ancient tradition that we can sort of trace back, because that's exactly what the clerics were doing between Gujarat and Yemen at the time. So, Qaratis al-Yemen, it's not much more time to talk about it, but that's what my coming project is about, really looking at how can we trace the mobility of these khizanat over the Indian Ocean. Right, then the final point, I talked a lot about the manuscripts in the khizana, but there are a lot of documents also present in the khizana. Again, there we find a lot of links to the Fatimids, both in terms of the materiality of these documents, but also in their social usage and their terminology. And for those of you who are interested, I can send a link of an article where I describe this in more detail. So let me come actually to the conclusion of this talk. So the question of Neo-Fatimism among the Bohras, and I focused on the Alavis, in parallel to and in competition with other Ismaili communities, awaits further research into sources and institutions, both inside and outside the Bohra Khizana. I am actually very excited to see that there at the moment is, really a new generation of very young PhD scholars who are looking at this question. And I think there are a lot more studies on the Bohras, and I hope that in a few years we can also talk about Bohra studies, which at the moment is still a rather small field. As I mentioned throughout this presentation, the point of my book is not to sort of prove every claim made that is a link to the Fatimids. As I said, the Bohras, all Bohra communities and the Alawis in particular, their identity is multifaceted as Gujaratis, as Indians in South Asia. However, it is what the Alawis have chosen to emphasize and flag as significant that I just argued, as Neo-Fatimids. And that is something that also perhaps has changed over times. In other words, the articulation of their Isma'ili religious identity has by no means been static or fixed throughout history. Future research on the articulation of the Bohras' religious identity and the precise dynamics of the Neo-Fatimid turn, if you can call it that, comparable to work on the South Asian Khoja followers of the Aga Khan, for instance, will enable us to better trace the roots of the Bohras' Neo-Fatimid claim. This problem, however, is of no direct relevance to the people of Badri Mahalla and Baroda. The Fatimid general store that I mentioned earlier is simply the place where one gets kulfi ice cream on a hot monsoon afternoon, while the Dai and the clerics uninterruptedly continue the copying for books, what they call their jihad for books. To them, their Khizanat al-Kutub is and always has been a Fatimid treasury of books in Baroda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akkerman, for this wonderful presentation. Just before I give the floor to Dr. Samira Sheikh, I wanted to say to the audience that if you have any questions, please send them in writing through the Q&A button at the through the Q&A option at the bottom of the control panel. And I see that some of you have started doing this. So I will first give the floor to Samira Sheikh and then ask some questions and convey those of the audience. Thank you. Thank you, Samira.
Thank you, Faraz. It's a privilege to be asked to share some thoughts on this really amazing project and book that Olly Akkerman is about to publish. And I'm so glad that the Institute of Isma'ili Studies, which is where I worked for several years, is providing her a platform to talk about some of her really important research. And it's great to see some of my former colleagues in the list of attendees. Good to see you. It's also really wonderful to see Sayyidna Sahib and members of the Alavi Dawa present on this occasion. I have myself been privileged to sit in the Diwan Khana of the at Badri Mohalla and speak to Sayyidna Sahib. So it's a great honor to be able to just start off the discussion on this really important research. So I've been hearing about Olly Akkerman's important research since more or less she started her fieldwork. And it's really wonderful to see it coming to fruition now. I have not yet read the book, but I'm looking forward really avidly to reading it. I've only had the privilege of reading one chapter. She has had the opportunity, which very few outsiders, perhaps no outsiders have had, which is to live with the community of Alavi Bohras in Badri Mohalla in Baroda, and to actually be in the presence of the royal family while they engage in the deeply secret practice of copying and physically handling the manuscripts. So what she has been able to do is, as she said at the beginning, is not just offer a sort of dry study of the materiality of these manuscripts as they might be in some repository in the West. It's not just a study of the physical condition of the manuscripts, the little signs and symbols that we might notice, in regular manuscript studies. it's a much more sort of dynamic exploration of how these manuscripts are an actually living tradition, that they have that in a sense the antiquity of the tradition of copying manuscripts is what is the ancient part of it. The actual manuscripts are physically transcribed and retranscribed over the generations by the family, thereby keeping a physical bodily connection with the Fatimid past. And I think that is a very important and different way of retaining a relationship with the past. After all, the texts that are passed down over generations are, of course, repositories of Fatimid learning and Fatimid theology, but the physical bodily manifestation that that is also passed down through the royal family's lineage, that provides the sort of the physical bodily, the embodied connection to the past. And I think that's such an important way to think about the ways manuscript traditions are passed down. The manuscripts themselves are important as artifacts, but they are also a connection. The leadership derives its authority, in a sense, from their custodianship of the manuscripts and their authority to be able to retranscribe them and to make them available for the next generation. So as Olly was speaking, there were a few thoughts that came to my mind, and I was just going to raise them in the form of comments or questions. And Olly, you should feel free to either tackle them or not. They might also gel with some of the questions that are coming from the audience. But I thought there were a few things that that I just wanted to sort of point out. And these come also from my my research on Gujarat, which I have been doing now for several years, but also my very impressionistic and uninformed understanding of the way the Alavi Bohra community has functioned. And as I said, I have been privileged to be in those rooms that you showed in your photographs, but I'm no expert, and I have very sort of outsider's understanding of the processes. So one of the most interesting things that you brought out with your photograph of the ice cream shop, as it were, was to think about the visual impact of Arabic in India, in Baroda, in Badri Muhalla in particular. And I'm going from sort of large to small here. So, and this is something I have thought about ever since I did some study of 14th, 15th century Arabic inscriptions in Gujarat. And the meaning that they carry, both for people who are able to read and understand and fully comprehend the meaning and the signification of the words, but also of their esoteric meaning in some cases, but also the larger impact that has on signaling the community's presence to outsiders, right? So in this case, what we've got is that the Alavi community signals its allegiance through various means. So one of those is, as you showed, the wearing of the white Fatimid, the white outfits that are signaling Fatimid allegiance, although they might be cut and it might have a sort of Indian cut to them. There is the wearing of the rida by the women, but there is also this really importance of the public presence of Arabic that signals, okay, now everybody may not be able to comprehend what's going on, may not be able to understand that this is the Alavi community's signaling, but they're certainly able to understand that, well, these are Muslims, maybe that they are Bohras. And of course, for the members of the community, this is important signaling of a Fatimid or a Neo-Fatimid lineage. So I was wanting you to talk a little bit more, perhaps, about how Arabic functions within the sort of multilingual space of the community itself. So it's of course a in the written tradition, in the manuscript tradition, of course, it has this great importance. But as you showed us, it's also got this public importance as being a way of signaling the community's presence and also allegiance to its membership. So the relationship between written Arabic manuscript tradition, and the sort of multilingual Gujarati, Hindi, English environment that all the community members inhabit. Perhaps that would be interesting to hear you speak about. The other more specific question was a little bit to tell us a little bit more about the relationship between the genres of texts that are copied and transmitted within the literary tradition. So we've got, of course, some of the important Fatimid texts that are carefully retranscribed by the royal family. And as you showed us, that you were able to experience that, that process as well. But is that true of all the Arabic texts in their collections? For instance, what about the divan written by recent Alavi dais, for instance? Are those transcribed in the same way? Are they subject to the same protocols of secrecy? Is poetry treated in the same way as sort of as Fatimid theological treatises? So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. What about copying practices in more specific detail? So for instance, I know that the actual content of the manuscripts is, of course, secret and should remain secret. But how does the community deal with, say, the possibility of mistakes and human error that might come in the process? How are those issues controlled and directed? And finally, I'm really intrigued by the question of secrecy. As you show us that, of course, this is a deeply secret tradition, and it has to be so in order for that sort of relationship with the past to be maintained, of the esoteric nature of the text to be maintained within a very specific and very demarcated number of people. However, as you said, there's also this, the open secrecy, right? The manuscripts might be visible to other community members. They might be visible in the cupboards that line the divan khana. And I think that has something to do with, again, the point I raised at the beginning of the sort of presence of Arabic as a signifier of the community's presence in a neighborhood. I mean, after all, we are talking about the Badri Mohalla, which is in a deeply Hindu majority city in Gujarat. We are talking about a community that is also outnumbered by Sunni Muslims in Baroda itself. So clearly the community has to make an effort to signal its presence and the uniqueness of its presence in its circumstances. And that's where I'm wondering whether there is a sort of dynamic relationship between the avowal of secrecy and the actual practical availability of these secret documents to members outside the royal family. That, you know, that there is a signaling that they exist, and they have to be seen to be existent, right, in order for that sense of belonging to be reinforced. And perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to stop there, but thank you for this wonderful introduction to your book and your really important research. Looking forward to the book.
Thank you so much, Samira. These are all very, very important points, and you're absolutely right. The question of language within the space of the Treasury of Books, of the Mohalla, the community and even, within, the city of Baroda in a way, how the Bohras sort of portray that. Let me start by answering your last question about secrecy, because unfortunately there was not a lot of time in the presentation left to talk about it, even though it's such an important practice within the community, but also vis-a-vis sort of the Bohras in the outside world. So I mentioned the term taqiyya, the dissimulation of one's religious identity. So that's one layer of secrecy where one, of course, doesn't talk to outsiders about your doctrinal beliefs. But then there is a second sort of inner communal layer of secrecy, I would say. That's how I describe it, which is indeed the fact that these esoteric manuscripts are only accessible by a few initiated scholars. And if you're not one of those initiated scholars of the royal family, then you will never have access to those, right? So this idea of open secrecy, it's very interesting because on the one hand, we see the Bohras very visibly, as I said, it's sort of like, we are Bohra neon colors, especially in the Rida, because the Rida, I should mention, is very different from any other sort of sartorial practice that we find in Gujarat, but also in the larger Indian Ocean. And there's a specific reason for that, but we won't go into this. So we have on the one hand sort of this paradox, right, of outside and inside and those dynamics. And then at the same time, we sort of what seems like a paradox we have in the inside. So those who cannot access and who can access the manuscript. And I think you're absolutely right. It's also about signaling or even sort of claiming space claiming a spot in the public space, right, of we are Bohri. And I think this is happening more and more. I think that's why it is exactly sort of this revival of Fatimid architecture, which we also see now, not just, across the Indian Ocean, but we see that in Mumbai, for instance, right, where huge complexes have been built. That's another signal of, well, look, we are here, but we as Bohris have a very specific identity. And of course, Arabic plays an important role. I mean, I mentioned the mosque in Mombasa. I mean, it has beautiful Arabic calligraphy as well. But it is constantly sort of the tension of access and non-access, right? To the community, which also in my own research, was a long process, but then also within the community between clerics and believers. And that picture I showed of the manuscripts laying around, from what I observed, I think it's truly like this, that believers sort of need to know what they sort of cannot access, right? Because if something is secret and you cannot see it or you don't know about it, then it doesn't work. However, it's like a child who wants, okay, that's not a good example, but I've just had a baby, so I'm in this sort of kids, if the child wants to have a sweet, right, but he doesn't know that it exists, then, he doesn't want the sweet, right? And it's the same with secrecy in a way. So I think believers, when they visit the Dai, but even when they go to ceremonies, they need to see these manuscripts. So for instance, I went on ziyara, on a pilgrimage with the Alawis to Ahmedabad, which is where we have the biggest Bohra graveyards, and all the Dais are buried there. And to my surprise, the Dai actually took with him a very secret scroll, which was not supposed to leave the Khizana, right? But he took it in his handbag and he brought it with him. And this scroll was sort of publicly revealed in the Musafir Khana, which is sort of the inn where all the Alawis stayed during their pilgrimage. And, during a very emotional speech about sort of the different bifurcations of the communities, this scroll was actually taken out. And of course, no one was close enough to actually read it. And also it was, as you say, in Arabic, which is not necessarily accessible to all believers. However, the fact that this sacred artifact was present there, was taken out of the bag and was showed for just half an hour, and then it went back into the bag. That is exactly, I think, how it works in a way. And that's also how you, I guess, maintain a secret tradition. Because as I said, even as secret objects, these manuscripts play a central role in the life of the believers. So it's about lifting a veil, lifting the tip of a veil in a way, but not too much, right? And that's how, of course, well, this legitimizes, as I said, the power, the position of the clerics, of the dai, and so forth. But in my monograph, I mean, answering your second question about the status of Arabic, this is very fascinating, because in my monograph, I have sort of described Arabic sort of as almost a language of secrecy, because Bohras learn Arabic in the madrasa. However, this is Quranic Arabic, and this is to only a certain level. But sort of the social act of the community is known as lisan al-da'wa, which is a very interesting language. I mean, it's the language of the da'wa, which must have also historically gone back to this period when the Isma'ili missionaries tried to convert people in Gujarat, right? So it's a mix of Gujarati, of Urdu and Arabic. And it's written in Urdu script, but actually it has a lot of Gujarati influences. So that's what believers, what they read when they read religious literature that is not necessarily esoteric, but more exoteric. For instance, on law, or how to pray, or how to go on ziyarah. This is all in lisan al-da'wa, and that is within the community sort of a language that is accessible to all. But then again, outside of the community, this is something that people don't understand because it also has a lot of Arabic. So it's a very multi-layered system of usage of languages, and yes, but the esoteric manuscripts, all contain classical Arabic, and I think many of us know that that is not easy to read, and therefore only accessible to the clerics. And yeah, when it comes also to the genres of texts, I think I answered it a little bit, but specific languages also are attributed to specific genres of texts. So as I said, the esoteric ones are in classical Arabic. We have lisan al-da'wa, but for instance, the marthia, sort of the poetry that is recited, in remembering the death of Imam Hussein, that is often also performed in Urdu. So, and of course, it's all perhaps, it makes sense because Urdu is also a very important language, of course, in Muslim South Asia, but it is a very sort of multifaceted, yeah, I mean, you could just write a book about the languages used in Badri Muhalla, right? And yeah, that also goes, I guess, for the visual importance of Arabic, which, yeah, has sort of also been claimed by the Bohras. Does that answer your questions, Samira? Your great questions, yeah?
So thank you, both of you, Samira, for your comments and questions, and Olly for your answers. And I did have a question on this topic of the manuscript that is laying there, as you said. So I was going to ask, what is the status of this manuscript? And you covered this by saying that it is charged with spiritual prestige, one could say. Is it sometimes, the other question I had about this manuscript is it sometimes replaced, or is it always the same book that lays there? And can you say what book it is? And does it lay there only for prestige purposes, or is it sometimes useful to the Dai to consult, for example, in his rulings? Or yeah, that would be my first question. I have a lot more, and the audience has a lot more, so we'll come to that.
All right, Faris, thank you for this question. Well, actually, I have to disappoint you. In this case, the manuscript that was laying around on the floor was not the most exciting Batini manuscript. It was actually a copy of the Da'am al-Islam, the Pillars of Islam, written by the state Qadi of the Fatimids. Here we have the link again, Qadi al-Nu'man. However, I think it's very good that you mentioned this. The fact that this manuscript is laying there is not, that's sort of the beauty of how this works. It is not like put there with a lot of thought. That manuscript that day was laying there because the Dai at that point was consulting it, right? Because I did not mention this, I think, but all Bohras still practice Fatimid law, right? And this is basically the main manual of Fatimid law. And so the manuscripts are laying around not just for the sake of making a statement, but actually because they are used, they're consulted, they form an integral part of sort of practicing religiosity. So the next day, it could have been a completely different manuscript, which maybe would have belonged to Ilm al-Batin or Ilm al-Haqa'iq. However, the believers would still not touch it. You know, they would know that this is out of reach for us, and they would not actually pick it up and read it. So it could have been any other text as well. But it also shows that, again, these manuscripts are not dusty repositories from the past. They are used every day for consultation, for reading, memorization, and so forth.
Thank you. And so I had another question about the expression Neo-Fatimid. So first, I have two questions about this. First of all, can we date this reference to the Fatimid? Is it something that has always been going on since the foundation of this community in this region, or is it something that we can date, like the architecture? If it is Neo-Fatimid, when does this Neo appear? And my second question related to this concerns the contents of the manuscripts. When you say that there is this Fatimid reference, so we imagine that there are lots of Fatimid literature. What about the previous Neo-Fatimids that were in Yemen, the Tayyibi Dawa, which have produced a huge amount of literature? So what is the status of this Yemeni, Tayyibi, Isma'ili literature in the Khizana that you studied?
Thank you, Faris. Yeah, let me start by your last question. You're absolutely right. I also had a nice slide prepared on this, but somehow it evaporated. But you're absolutely right. When I refer to, well, it depends through which lens also you answer this question, right? We would say absolutely Tayyibid, sort of post-Fatimid Tayyibid Ismaili literature. Of course, these manuscripts actually, you know, they form a huge part of these Khizana collections, and I would say they are considered as sacred. They're seen as sacred in a way as the earlier works. Also, because this is something I did not discuss, but in the context of Gujarat, and I really think this is something where we also really see the Indic roots of the Bohras. The Dai has how do you say, a special sort of quality that is considered kal ma'soom, right? He's almost infallible. So the Imam is infallible, and then kal ma'soom is like he is sort of like infallible. Whichever object he touches or whichever manuscript he copies, you know, it's considered sacred, and not only that, it's considered to have special qualities, almost talismanic qualities. So any manuscript copied by a Dai within this entire sort of transmission history is considered a sacred object. And therefore, I would say they have sort of almost the same sacred status. Now, interestingly, we would talk about these different periods, right? Post-Fatimid and Tayyibi, post-Fatimid. But to the Bohras, and this is also what we see in their literature, in other historiographical works, to them, the Tayyibis are Fatimids. They're sort of a continuation of the Fatimids, right? So there's no distinction. So if I would really stick to their interpretation, I mean, they would still, you know, you refer to themselves as Fatimids and not Neo-Fatimids in a way. And that's, but I make that distinction because I do feel like it's good to have a distinction between, say, 10th century Cairo and, say, 2021 Gujarat. But your second question, yes, when did all of this start, this Neo-Fatimidism? Was it always there or not? I have gone through all the Bohra historiographical works of the 15th, 16th, 17th century, and I was not able to find, well, of course, there are references to the Fatimids, but there are also references to Taibi Yemen, to those Dais, and then also even, the Indian period. And I don't see that the Fatimids there actually have, a special sort of place. All manuscripts, all Dais, all authors are part of this sacred tradition. It is my suspicion, and that's also what I write in the conclusion of my book, that sort of this idea of we are Fatimids and not Tayyibis, because they could have also called themselves Tayyibis, is a more modern development. I think we can trace it, of course we can trace it in the architecture, but I think we have to go a little bit more back. And I really, that's why I said in the conclusion of this talk, just as now we've had a lot of scholarship about the Khojas in the colonial period and the Aga Khan and the establishment of authority as well. It is my suspicion, and I've also discussed this with other scholars, like for instance, Vineet Gupta, who is here, who will work on the same question, that in this context where, for instance, the Aga Khan, he has also made this link, of course, as living imam, as genealogy goes back to the Fatimids. This is something that we've, that especially came up in the colonial period. And it is my suspicion that the Bohras in a way responded to that, because these communities don't function in a vacuum, right? They're all together. But as I said, more research needs to be done. And ironically, I had access to the entire library of the entire collection of the Dawa, but not to actually the colonial literature on this. So that's for the future.
Thank you for your answer. Actually, I was going to ask on this whether this was related to a certain debate that occurred at a certain time, but which in that case, which debate and which time? But you have given some hints of this. So I will now convey a few questions of the audience. So first of all, we have a question by Sarah Elibiari, who asked, how are the ranks in the Dawa, Da'i, Ma'zun, Mukasir, appointed, and on what basis? And are all ranks from one family? And the second question by the same person is, what is the tradition of learning? Is knowledge and access to the manuscript not available to community members and limited to the royal family? So I think you've answered this one, but yeah.
Thanks, Faris. Yeah, that's an excellent question. The ranks of the Dawa, how are they appointed? So I'm now speaking for the Alawi community, because in the Dawoodi community, things, are a bit different. So the Da'i, Mukasir Sahib, Rasul Hudud Sahib, and Mazun Sahib are all part, first of all, of the same family, right? So it's very often that, the Da'i, for instance, the late Da'i, actually, he was the father, and the oldest son was the Mazun Sahib, and then the second oldest son was the Mukasir Sahib, and so forth. And well, it is fascinating how are these people appointed? I have written an entire chapter on this, because this goes via the concept of nas, which is again an Arabic term, which again also we find in Fatimid sources. It's basically what always, whenever there are schisms, there's always a conflict about the nas. So that's sort of the divine designation of who should be the next in line of the throne. According to the tradition, it's basically through divine revelation that when a Da'i, and I think it was the same with the Imams, to be very honest, that when a Da'i was sort of, towards the end of his life, he would get ilham, like a sort of divine inspiration from God, who should be the next in line of the throne. And interestingly, that's why I mentioned documents. But this, of course, causes all kinds of problems, because if you don't write that down, then when this person deceases, there are all kinds of conflicts, and that leads to bifurcations, which is why within the community there are scrolls, there are documents, and we can trace those to Yemen and even further back, which are known as sort of Nas scrolls. So those are like, written rolls on which the Dai would write down the name of the Mansus. So the Mansus is the person who the Nas is bestowed on. Well, within the Alawi community, we still have those scrolls. And it's fascinating because both in terms of the way they are used, because the idea was that traditionally or historically, whenever the new Dai would be appointed, people would go outside, unroll the scroll, which is literally the stories that we also know from Fatimid Cairo, right? The scrolls are unrolled and someone, an assistant of the royal household, proclaims sort of out loud, this is the name of the next Dai. So that's how it works. However, this obviously caused a lot of problems, as we, for instance, have seen now in the Daudi community, where we just had a schism because members of the families also said, well, actually these scrolls are falsified and so forth. So in the Alawi community, it is less complicated because it is usually transferred from father to son. But the practice still exists of those scrolls. And just as I said, when I went on ziyarah to Ahmedabad, it was one of those scrolls that were also shown. So they have a very important ceremonial function in a way.
Yes, so this is about the ranks that are, the appointments through Nas. What about ranks that you can access through initiation? I mean, are there such ranks? And this is, I think, the sense of the question that I just asked, the relation between learning knowledge and the fact that it's within a certain family or open to other. Yeah. I mean, there's a hadith that is to find in Fatimid sources and Tayyibi sources, where the Imam Jafar al-Sadiq says that the religion is 7 ranks, 4 that are from us and 3 that are not from us. Or sometimes it's 3 that are from us and 4 that are not from us. So what we understand is that the 3 that are from us those are the ranks that you cannot access through initiation. They're divine election. But the other ranks, these are accessible through proper initiation. So, I mean, are there such ranks in the?
That is super interesting that you mentioned this, Faiz, because that is exactly sort of sounds like these ranks, right? So exactly. So the first 4 ranks, the Dai, and those other 3, right? So they have full access to the highest level of ilm al-batin. That is sort of a given, and they learn that from when they're young boys, they're initiated. But then there are ranks in the dawah of people of mullahs, basically of people who also do a lot of service for the community and who are very loyal to the royal family, who are initiated to certain aspects of these texts. So not everything, and you I know this better than I do, of course, that there are various levels, right, which you're initiated. And ilm al-haqqaq is sort of the highest level, but and there are also a lot of treatises on this, of course. So yeah, it is exactly like I said, sort of lifting sort of the tip of this veil of esoteric knowledge, right? There are indeed people in the dawah who sort of have access to bits and pieces in a way, but that is very different from from the real clerical establishment of the secular royal family.
Thank you. So I'll move on to more questions. Your talk has really sparked a lot of interest from the audience. So we have a few historical or questions. Several people are asking what are the differences between the different Bohra communities, and if there are philosophical and theological differences, or if the differences are mainly related to leadership. And someone is asking as well if there is an explanation to the use of Alawi in the name of this Bohra community, but I'm sure you can shed some light on this. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, yes, so the first question, very briefly, there are no theological differences between the three groups, also with the idea that most theological treatises were written either when the imams were still, present, or in the Tayyibi period, which is when the imams were, well, not, they were in hiding, but it was not so long ago. So it is more a question of leadership. You're absolutely right. And then the second question of Alawi, yes, I absolutely should have explained this in this talk. The name Alawi or Alwi is derived from, well, basically the person who the community followed when they split up from the Dawdis, which was Sayyidina Yusuf Ali Shamsuddin. And yeah, that I think answers the question, no?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So I have, sorry, let me just scroll down through the questions. So we have a question by Umar Ali de Unsaga, who is academic administrator of the Quranic Studies Unit here at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. So Omar asks if the copying of text is done by very authoritative people or even infallible people, is there any exercise involving revision, correction, collation, annotation of a newly produced manuscript, or none at all? And Omar has a second question asking also, when manuscripts are recopied, are comments added in the margins? In other words, is the copying a mere reproduction, or does it involve new thinking and ideas, especially given that the Sayyidina would be the one who could add his own written commentary?
Right. Thank you. Hi, Omar. We met a few years ago in London. Thank you for your questions. So who are the manuscripts copied by? Well, in the Alawi community, that is really only the Da'i, the Mazun Sahib, Muqasir Sahib, and Rasul Sahib. And it's actually the current Da'i who has been very, very involved in copying the manuscripts. I observed this. He also initiated me to the practice to sort of understand how this worked. And I think he sort of dedicated his entire life to really recopying sort of almost the entire Khizana, which is necessary because in the climate of Gujarat, manuscripts, they fall apart very easily. The question of revision and collection, yes, absolutely. So, I mean, Samira actually somehow also touched upon this question, and I'm sorry I never got to answer it. What do you do when you make a mistake, right? So between these four sort of sacred clerics, in a way, I mean, I call them sacred because they have such a special status in the communities. They also read and revise each other's manuscripts. And what is interesting is, because I can sort of guess where your question comes from, within the Bohra community or within the Khizana, there's not the system of an ijaza, right? Where you sort of get it's sort of a seal from your master in a way, saying, this person has transmitted the text properly. But in a way, the Da'i is the person who does this. And he does this with all the manuscripts that are copied. Now, in the Alawi community, as I said, it's only very few people who do this. But the interesting thing is that when I was cataloging the manuscript collection in Baroda, I came across a lot of manuscripts that either had, in Kipit, either the basmala was missing, or it looked completely different paleographically, or was cut out. And then we sort of reconstructed that previously, sort of instead of putting an ijaza in the manuscript, because why would you put an ijaza actually if you know that it's only very few people who copy these manuscripts? The right of writing the basmala at the beginning of the text was basically kept to the, or was left to the Dai. This was sort of his royal ceremonial rite. So that you would copy the manuscript from beginning to end, also write a proper colophon where you mention the Asr, so the reign of the Dai at the time, but you would leave the space of the Basmala open. And the Basmala would then be sort of in very beautiful bookhand, be written, or in sort of in a very calligraphical way placed in the manuscript. And that was sort of the stamp of approval in a way. So the Dai from head to toe would be present in the manuscript, as he was mentioned, in the colophons, as well as in kippets. And he would, of course, revise. And well, when I copied the manuscript, just for really understand the practice, this is exactly also what he did. And he would make corrections in the margins, and he would add things, because I was, of course, a very poor copyist. Your second question, what about comments? Are new things added? Yes and no. If we look at it's sort of the body of the text, of the contents, I would say this is very stable tradition in a way. And we can see that because I have seen manuscripts that were from the 16th century of a certain text, and manuscripts that were, copied basically 20 years ago, and they were not directly copied from each other. And, the text would be incredibly stable, and not many comments would be added, because also the idea is that the text is kamil, right? It's perfect. And even though the Dai, of course, has this godly inspiration and so forth, you don't mess with the text from the past in a way. However, in my book, I also have devoted an entire chapter to the marginalia that are found in the manuscript, even though this is actually prohibited and not supposed to be done. So new ideas are not necessarily added to these texts, because they're perfect and you cannot mess with them. But at the same time, they're very rich traditions of marginalia, which actually show us how these manuscripts were used, and not necessarily as secret texts, but actually, I think there was also not a lot of paper around, or paper was expensive. So I have come across so many interesting marginalia, for instance, that describe how to take Quranic omens if someone visits you. I call this the planetary pregnancy pie, which is literally a chart that I found in the flyleaf of a manuscript, which describes if a woman comes to you, of course, this was in pre-modern times, and wants to know if she's pregnant, you have to perform this ritual. And then there's a chart with the planets, and she has to put her finger on there, and then this is explained. So no, new ideas are not added, but then at the same time, completely different marginal traditions exist in these manuscripts, which show also their social usage, and also healing, veneration, those kind of traditions.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, actually, because it shows that this identity is, as you said yourself, multi-layered. So, of course, the Neo-Fatimid or the Fatimid aspects is very important, because it's how the community refers to itself. But these rituals that you just mentioned, for example, related to the planets, things like that, I mean, to my knowledge, this kind of things is quite rare in Fatimid tradition.
Yeah.
So where does it come from? That would be an interesting field of research. I don't know if you've delved a bit into this.
Well, I mean, it definitely also shows, and I cannot emphasize this enough, but also the other aspects of the identity of the Bohras, which is, of course, the Bohras as a community are deeply rooted in Gujarat and are also proud Gujaratis, and many rituals, for instance, the taking of Quranic omens is very common in South Asia, right? That's just one example, and I think there are many of these examples.
Thank you. So some attendees are asking about, are curious about how you came to this study. So, for instance, Husseini Adenwala asked, how did you come to know the existence of the Alawi Dawah? Amin Rahmani asks, while cataloging, what were your primary motives? And how do you determine the place, the date and place if not given? Oh, when studying the manuscripts.
Yes. Okay, thank you for these questions. Well, the first question, you know, when I studied Arabic, then I was very intrigued by sort of history of Shi'ism, but I was always really interested also in connections between, say, well, what is today the Middle East and South Asia. I don't know, that's how I came across the Bohras, I suppose. I mean, I was always intrigued, of course, by, you know, the secrecy that revolves around these texts. And I myself, of course, experienced it many times that I was not allowed or able to access the treatises that I wanted to study, because when I did my PhD, I was interested in these ilm al-haqa'iq, ilm al-batini, super esoteric texts. And now more and more of them become available, but at that time, I mean, this is 10 years ago, that was not so easy. And I mean, also we have, of course, the social practice of taqiyya among the Bohras, right? So I reached out to various communities, and the Alavi Bohras were very forthcoming. They were interested in someone who would study their manuscripts. And I think I get the question a lot, like, why the Alawis and why did they let you in, right? I have some of my students who say, like, well, we don't believe any of this. If it was also secret, they would not let you in. Did you bribe them? What, you know? And of course, I mean, I did not bribe them, but I think, you know, the Alawis are the second largest Bohra community, right? But it's always sort of the Dawdis that are in the spotlights, whether it's in politics, well, through architecture, but also, right, if we look at the field of Isma'ili studies. And I think, therefore, the Alawis also invited me to stay with them, despite these levels of taqiyya, to study their manuscripts, and also their community to also gain some academic attention in a way. And I believe the second question was how, why I catalog the manuscripts, is that correct? And how I would date them if there was not a date?
Yes, what was your motive in cataloging, and maybe your methods to date the texts?
Well, when I came to Baroda, I mean, this is quite a long story, which I describe in depth in the book, because it also reflects on my positionality in the community. Like, how do you write about a community with so much secrecy? I first really had to gain the trust of the clerics, who then sort of led me in the community. Then I had to gain the trust of the community, right? As they said, we don't entertain people for fun, and we first have to trust you, and rightly so. So I first lived there for a while before I actually got to see any of the manuscripts. And I, at that time, as I said, was still very much interested in studying these highly esoteric Batini treatises. But the longer I stayed in the community, and I would have actually gotten access to them on the long run. I mean, this took months and months, but I mean, the community in a way really opened my eyes to sort of, you know, looking at manuscripts in a completely different way. Because again, I was just trained as looking at a manuscript as a philological treatise, which is very interesting to study them. But when I was in the community, I suddenly saw, you know, hey, a Bohra manuscript is laying around there. It's supposed to be secret. What is it doing there? I saw that people were blessed, you know, through these manuscripts, that manuscripts were venerated, that were taken to ceremonies. And suddenly I realized, without the community, there is no manuscript tradition, right? And that's how I sort of became more and more interested in actually what is the social importance of these texts. Now, of course, the community or the clerics also had their interests, right? I mean, it's nice that this you know, scholar from Europe is visiting us, but you know, I also wanted to do something for them, and also, you know, they also had their interests. And you know, I've discussed sort of this whole transmission history from Yemen to India as if it happened like that, but you know, Gujarat has a monsoon every year, which is super humid and disastrous. It's the worst climate for manuscripts to survive. It really is a disaster. I mean, I've seen termites and plagues and whatever. Like, you know, these manuscripts basically, after a few years, fall apart. And therefore, I think for the clerics, you know, they were really, it was like urgent for them that someone would catalog these manuscripts, someone who would trust, you know, who they trusted, and also to make sort of an inventory of what is really there. Because I said, it's very common among these Bohra communities that there are these bifurcations, right? As one just happened in the Dawoodi community. And also manuscripts then become dispersed, khizanat become, you know, one part of the khizanat goes there, one part goes there. So I think it was very important for the community that their collection was documented. And to me, this was a wonderful opportunity, of course, because that gave me access to all the manuscripts of the khizana, literally all of them, and the documents. And also, I think, gave me sort of the opportunity to, you know, also give something back to the community. And therefore, this catalog is really something that I prepared for the Dai, and it won't be published. It's really, yeah, for the community.
So this catalog, you said it won't be published, and I suppose because of the secrecy surrounding the contents, exact contents of the contents of the khizana. So someone in the audience who remained anonymous asked, in today's time, many people use the internet and would have access to digital copies of Fatimid works, such as those of Al-Qadi Nu'man. Would that influence the sacredness of such works? And where does the sacredness lie? Is it in the contents of the manuscripts or their originality? And I think you've made the point that it's the object in itself that has some sacredness. But it's true that it's a good question, I think. How does the community react to the publication, the growing number of publicly available publications of these Isma'ili texts? Because maybe also the attitude has changed over the years, because apparently in the 1950s or 60s, a book, the Kitab al-Kashf, was published, and the Dawoodi Dai of the time ordered its destruction. So, but it was nevertheless distributed, and it has reached us. And I wrote my dissertation about it.
Of course.
But so yes, how does this? How is this apprehended by the community?
No, it's an excellent question. And it's actually also something I've been thinking a lot about, because I think COVID has really sort of speeded up that process even more, right? So I also get talismans from the Dai on my WhatsApp, right? And you can also sort of ask, what about the sacred materiality of this talisman? Does it still work when it's online? But in this case, absolutely, it's absolutely true that, of course, some of the highest esoteric texts are available and are being published and are available online. But I think there is a difference. Well, first of all, as of course you know, Faraz, better than I do, that these texts are incredibly difficult to understand, right? They were written not in modern standard Arabic, so you have to have a certain, well, knowledge, first of all, of Arabic, and then of classical Arabic. And one can really understand when you read them that, you know, this reading went along with several, you know, rounds of initiation, because, you know, I've tried to read several of them in Baroda with the Dai, and it was a disaster. I mean, my Arabic was, you know, obviously not good enough. It's a very difficult text to read. So that's one thing. And I think also the Mazoon Saab once said it very beautifully, like, you can read the text and you can even understand the Arabic. However, you sort of have to embody the text, right? So it is also something that goes through the ear into the qadr, right? Into your chest, basically. So you can just read it, but if you're not initiated to it, And also, for instance, if you have not memorized it, because part of reading is memorizing, right? That's something we don't do anymore, but the whole idea is you embody the text by memorizing it, and only then you can copy it. So there are different ways of reading in a way. And again, yeah, I do think you can still have access to the text, but they're very, very difficult to understand. But of course, that's also where you know, practices of secrecy come from, right? Because this is definitely a point. Text can easily be misunderstood. And, you know, like, especially in a climate of sort of like Wahhabism and whatever, things can be misinterpreted. I mean, that is, of course, really, really a problem.
But I mean, still on this matter, how do you think, would the community react to academic inquiry on the text, you know, since you're not allowed to share the catalog? I suppose that you're also not allowed to use these manuscripts for a critical edition of a certain text, right? But what if the text is already published and out there? So
that's a
well, I mean, typically,
I understand what you mean.
For the case of the Kitab al-Kashf, which has been edited twice, 2 available manuscripts that anyone can access. And there are lots more of manuscripts of this text in private libraries.
Of course.
So what if the matter was to, you know, improve the existing editions, which are very problematic and are filled with mistakes?
The interesting thing is that you would be surprised that actually many of these editions, including also the editions of the Institute of Isma'ili Studies, they all end up in the Khizana in Baroda. So the Daudi has a massive collection of all of these books, and actually that is very, very nice in a way. It also, look, no Khizana is complete, right? And no manuscript is also, you know, there are always mistakes, there are always parts missing. So in that sense, the interesting thing is, yes, there's an interest in the community, and perhaps certain people should not access these texts. But at the same time, they're also a very helpful tool, actually, for the clerics to maintain their collection. And that's a very interesting interplay between academia, community, and the community in a way. And yes, you're right, certain texts are being edited. However, I mean, I would still not do that because I took an oath, right?
No, I wasn't talking about what you would do, but how
no, I know
the community would
how they would respond. Well, there is definitely great interest, of course, in these texts, absolutely. And of course, I mean, go on any sort of online database, you can download them. But I think there's a difference still between understanding them and sort of having access to them, right?
Well, thank you very much. I think we're reaching the end of our session. I will just have 2 more things to say. First of all, we have a message by Hussein Jassani, who is responsible for the new South Asian Studies unit at the Institute of Isma'ili Studies. So Hussein Jassani says that Dr. Daftari and him visited the Alavi Mutlaq and their library in Baroda in 2007, and that they were extremely generous and showed them their manuscript collection. And he says that with the establishment of the South Asian Studies unit at the IIS, we hope to work very closely with the leadership to bring more invaluable resources to light for the academic community. And that he has been in touch with Sayyidina Sahib, who has always been generous and kind to offer his support. So before we end, I will just remind the title of your forthcoming book, which will be published in next year in 2022 by Edinburgh University Press. So the title is the same as today's lecture: A Neo-Fatimid Treasury of Books, Arabic Manuscripts among the Alavi Bohras of South Asia. And if you would allow me, I will share the next lectures in this series. So first of all, thank you again, Dr. Akkerman for this wonderful session. Thank you as well to Dr. Samira Sheikh for joining us and agreeing to discuss this with us. So 2 more lectures are planned in our series by the end of 2021. The first one by Dr. Christian Sanner in October, and the second one by Dr. George Warner in December. The abstracts and details of Dr. Sanner's lecture will be uploaded shortly on the IIS website, so stay tuned. And thank you for attending, and see you hopefully next month for the next lecture. Thank you again.
Thank you, Faris. Thank you, Samira.